Welcome back to another episode of Inside SFPS. My name is Cody Donarski, Public Information Officer with Santa Fe Public Schools, and today I am joined by a very, very special guest. Today I am joined by the Deputy Superintendent of Santa Fe Public Schools, one of the Deputy Superintendents of Santa Fe Public Schools, should I say, Miss Vanessa Romero. Miss Romero, how are you today?
Good, thank you. You're always so gracious and kind to me.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is your second time on the podcast. The first time we had you on, we talked about standards-based grading and kind of the transition that we are making as a district to standards-based grading. Today, we're going to do something not different for you from the last time you were on the podcast. We're going to get to know a little bit more about you. First, want to start with, so you are a Santa Fe native. I know you graduated from Capital. What elementary and middle school or junior high schools did you go to?
Sure. I'm a product of the Santa Fe Public Schools. I attended La Goita Elementary, which is now Mandela is housed there. And then I also attended Alameda, which is now Aspen, and then graduated from Capital High.
And then, so one of the things that I found out pretty early on is that your dad worked for the district?
He did.
And
yes.
What was his role?
He was the chief operating officer.
So
facilities and maintenance. And
so it would be what Miss Christy Yonda Wagner is, the comparable.
Yes.
And then was your mom a teacher?
My mom also worked for the district.
Okay.
She started out as an instructional assistant at Tesuque Elementary. And then she transitioned here to BF Young, actually, and was a supported Title I secretary.
Oh, so you're about as Santa Fe Public Schools as it comes.
Right.
With that, did you want to get into education when you left, like when you were graduating high school and you were graduating Capital? Was education something you wanted to get into?
No. Quite ironically, in high school, I took tons of theater classes, so I wanted to major in theater. So went to New Mexico State, started off my degree in theater, realized that it was going to be super, super hard to find a job, and switched my degree to Spanish and organizational communications. So that's what I focused on. And then got a job in Albuquerque recruiting and helping people find positions in Albuquerque, and realized that I absolutely hated it. And I remember calling my mom and just telling her I'm not really happy with what I'm doing. And she said, well, Vanessa, you know, there's teaching positions opened here in Santa Fe, and maybe we could just connect you with a principal and see if there's a chance. So I met with the principal at La Goita, where I attended elementary, and she interviewed me.
Who was that principal?
Her name was Vanessa Romero at the time. And she said, well, Vanessa, you don't have an education background, but I know your parents and I know they're hard workers. And so if you commit to taking classes to become a teacher, I'll look at hiring you. And I absolutely fell in love with teaching. I started probably 2 months after the school year and just absolutely fell in love teaching second grade bilingual.
When you were going through high school, were you opposed to education? Because I know, I've had a handful of people, more than a handful, I should say, of people on the podcast who have connections to education, whether it was their parents or grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And either they were like, my aunt was a teacher and, I wanted to do that, or they took the other route of like, my parents were educators and I didn't want to do that. Was that?
That was not the case at all. To be quite honest, when I was in college, I floundered because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I took a lot of liberal classes and, like I said, theater and philosophy and classes, sociology. But yeah, no, that was not anything as far as being opposed to being in education. I just never expected it.
Yeah. And then, so you started teaching. What drew you to the little kids? Because everyone's got their own grade ranges, ages that they want to teach. What drove you to the littles?
Well, at the time, I didn't have an education background. That was the only position that was open, a second grade bilingual class. And so I was bilingual and stuck with that for 5 years. And I really liked the little ones. They're just so precious and they learn so much within a year. So to have these second graders barely learning to read, and then by the end of second grade, they were reading chapter books was just super rewarding.
That growth is like so much more noticeable
Absolutely.
than at high school, maybe, where it's, you teach them these advanced concepts, and a lot of the stuff that they're learning in high school is deeper than like, oh, do you know about the Civil War? No. Do you know how to break down this,
Right.
the antagonist, whatever, all of that stuff. I praise the people who want to work with the little kids because, my daughter's 2.5. She's at the Early Childhood Center, and I'm in and out of schools all the time, and loud noises just send me. And the kinder, first, second classrooms are so loud. They're so like sensory overload. There's a lot of noises and screaming and whatever. How do you manage being able to be in a classroom with so much going on?
Oh, it's quite interesting. My first year teaching, and I feel so bad for the students that I taught. No experience. And so I would have parties that would last half a day, like Halloween parties, and we'd do paper mache projects, and the kids would go home a complete mess with paper mache, wet clothes. So I always, when I see former students, I always say, oh, I apologize for, and they say, no, Miss Romero, we loved your class and you were so good to us. But management took time to pin down. Like I said, I did second grade for 5 years and then went to first grade, absolutely loved it. And so I think by the third year of teaching second grade, I had better structures and classroom management in place.
So you taught second grade, you taught first grade, and then you taught 1 year of kindergarten?
I taught 2 years of kindergarten because I thought, wow, if I made so much progress with second graders, I saw the same type of amazing progress with first graders. And I thought, oh man, if I go down to kindergarten, I'm going to see tons of progress. And I did that for 2 years, and I would say that kindergarten were the hardest 2 years of my teaching career.
And you weren't at La Goita at that point, were you?
I was. So I started at La Goita teaching second grade, and then I moved back to Las Cruces for my master's in educational leadership, and that's where I taught first grade. And then when I came back to the Santa Fe Public Schools, I was hired back at La Goita, and I went down to kindergarten.
Okay. I've told this story probably 3 times on the podcast just because it's my favorite story to tell. And it originated from Georgia Baca, the principal at Milagro, and I don't mean to bring it up as like a embarrassing moment or anything
hilarious.
like that. I just think it speaks volumes for those of us who are not educators, what you are working with in kindergarten. And so the story I'm talking about. I don't want to butcher it, and I don't want to say anything else on it. But if you could tell the story, just because I think it's so interesting about what kindergarten teachers actually have to teach.
It was my very first day teaching kindergarten. I had already had 6 years of teaching under my belt. And I remember asking the kids to line up so that I think maybe we were going to recess or to lunch. I don't remember. And the kids just looked at me like, what? And I panicked and I ran to Georgia Baca's classroom. She taught right across the hall from me. And I looked at her and I said, Georgia, they don't know how to line up. And she looked at me and she started laughing and she was like, Vanessa, you have to teach them. And it blew my mind. So yeah, you're right. There were kids that did not know how to hold pencils or how to hold books. And we didn't have pre-K at the time. So they didn't come to school with some of those experiences. So we were responsible for teaching them.
And I think that's so interesting. And especially now with my knowledge of early childhood ed with my daughter is I see them lining up. When they walk from the 2Y classroom to the lunchroom, they get into a line. They know how to walk. When I see them walking, there's been times where I've been walking in and I see them going from one room to another. They do line up. And these are 2-year-olds. So without going too deep into the early childhood ed part, I do think it speaks volumes about that, because if they're able to learn those skills that early on,
correct,
they're able to go into kindergarten not having to spend a day or 2 or 3 or a week or 2 weeks learning, hey, this is how you hold a pencil. This is how you line up to go to recess. This is how you move about school.
Correct.
And I think that, again, speaks volumes of early childhood ed and even just pre-K, 4Y pre-K,
right,
being able to establish those norms, we can call them, allows you to get into school and it's not your first experience at school. And for my daughter, she'll be in school for 3 years before she even gets to kindergarten.
And can you imagine all the skills she's already gaining, right? And by the time she gets to kindergarten.
Yeah, all of those are there.
Right.
So after kindergarten, what was your next step after kindergarten?
So while I was teaching and I moved back to Las Cruces, worked on my admin license and taught. And then I came back to Santa Fe and completed my internship hours while I taught. And I was very fortunate to be appointed to an assistant principalship at Agua Fria, which is now El Camino. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have to interview. I just was appointed by the superintendent, and that was my first experience as an assistant. I stayed there 1 year, and I was asked by Miss Robin Noble, who is now the executive director of human resources. She was a principal at Remedios Thomas at the time. Mm-hmm. And she asked me if I would be her assistant principal. The school Remedios Thomas was identified as one of the lowest performing schools in the state. And so we had a bunch of funding to reform the school. And she asked me if I would be her assistant principal there. So I was lucky and went to Remedios Thomas for a year and a half, got amazing professional development on PLCs and the Columbia University reading and writing curriculum. And then I got pulled the middle of my second year at Remedios Thomas and was appointed to the principalship at Salazar. And so I was the principal at Salazar for about 2.5 years. And I took some of the good learning that I had from all the professional development from Remedios Thomas. So then Robin decided to leave the state. And at the time, the deputy superintendent asked me if I would be interested in going back to Remedios Thomas as the principal. And I jumped on it because I absolutely loved that community. So I stayed there. I want to say 3 years as principal. And during that time, we were recognized for having a state-of-the-art bilingual program by the state. We were also recognized nationally for implementing PLCs in that third year that I was there. Was very fortunate to participate in conferences with Carnegie Learning on PLCs and math instruction. And then once again, I think got super lucky because I've always been I'm quiet and I'm not very outgoing.
You're more introverted. I don't think there's any hiding that.
I'm definitely an introvert. Linda Sink, the deputy superintendent, came to visit me at Remedios Thomas and just said, Vanessa, how would you feel about supervising your colleagues? And it had never crossed my mind before. And I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. And so did that, supported schools for the past 4 years. And then I've been in this role. This is my second year.
Going back a little bit, it might seem obvious, but I still think it's very interesting because I feel like when you get into education to become a teacher, not become a principal. Becoming a principal is something that happens after teaching. You don't go to school to become a principal. And it's one of these interesting careers, jobs, whatever you want to call it, that you don't really go to school for. You go to school for something else, and then you get promoted to that. So I'm always curious about kind of that transition.
And why?
And why, and what was that transition like, and why did you make it?
So very interesting. I was finishing my 5th year teaching second grade at La Guaita, and the principal at the time, Alan Perez, was my supervisor, and I became very passionate and loved doing lesson plans and looking at curriculum and data for my class, that I told her, I think I'm going to start my master's in curriculum and instruction. I said, I love it, and it's my passion. And she said, Vanessa. And I said, because one of these days I would love to be in the office of curriculum and instruction. That's what I told her. And she gave me such great advice. She said, getting positions like that, you need to be an administrator so you have a full understanding of from the classroom to running a school. And she said, I encourage you to get your admin license. And I kind of thought about it for a while, but realized she was already asking me to do a lot of, administrative things at the school. And that's when I decided.
And out of curiosity, and again, a lot of this comes from me not being an educator, what is required in an admin license and what do you learn during that process?
Oh, sure.
Why do you need an admin license to become a principal or, in any sort of like admin?
Sure. So the admin program, there's law classes, there's budget classes, and then of course you can specialize in certain things. So I focused on organizational aspects of administration, but it's the law and budget and scenarios. And
the full scope of what goes on in a school, not what goes on in the classroom, but the scope of it's essentially going back to school and learning how to become an admin instead of going to school and learning to become a teacher.
Correct.
That makes more sense. And I've been in this position for 3 years since the first time I've asked that question. So thank you for that. So for those who don't know, and I know you do a lot, oversee a lot in the easiest, quickest way possible, what do you do in your role? I know that's a loaded question, but
overall it's supporting academic programs. So that includes departments such as special ed, Native American services, language and culture, wellness, probably forgetting a department or two. And then, of course, supporting the schools, but all academic aspects.
I've never gotten to ask Superintendent this question, so I'll ask you first before I have him on to talk about his story. How do you balance so many departments? And one of the things that I always admired about Dr. Garcia was how she was so in tune with everything that was going on. She would, hop on a meeting with me and she'd be like, I just got done with a budget meeting going on with this. And then before that, I was meeting with Josh, our legal counsel, about this, and was always so knowledgeable about all the inner workings. And I've always admired that. And I know, you're in a very similar position. How do you stay up to date with what's going on in student wellness and language and culture and being up to date and still being knowledgeable and aware of all the things that are going on?
First, I will say that the staff is amazing. I love the team and I love my colleagues. And with that, we also try and keep a clear line of communication. And so there's lots of collaboration between department heads and weekly one-on-one meetings. And I try my very hardest to participate in events or trainings that they may have. I'm not always there, but I try to be there. So that's how I try to stay abreast. But I will say the superintendent position is even more so because they're dealing with
because you see one wing of it.
I'm just seeing teaching and learning.
And then you have the other side of Christiana Wagner, who oversees student nutrition and transportation and custodial services and a completely different wing. And then the superintendent oversees all of it.
Right.
I admire how much you have to know and be aware of to operate.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to having really strong supervisors and directors that are very knowledgeable. And so they teach me too.
This is a question that I don't think I've asked yet to anyone on the podcast, but I think being in your position, there's a lot of future goals and ideas. You can't just operate in the now. You can't be like, oh yeah, what's on my schedule tomorrow? You have to look down the road a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years even, in a position like yours. What is something that you, and maybe it's not necessarily you specifically, but something that you're looking down the road towards, whether it's implementing or for students or for anything?
Well, I think, 2.5 years ago, we decided to move towards standards-based grading and instruction, and we're right in the middle of that now. Mm-hmm. And it has been a journey and it has taken time, but I think the one belief that I have and thing that I hold on to is just being an educator, especially a teacher, their capacity and their belief in all of their kids to make gains. And that's a belief system. So I don't know if that's necessarily a goal, but supporting the schools in giving the tools and professional development or resources or whatever a school site needs so that the teachers at the school site have the capacity to make changes in kids' lives.
And I think the most important thing about that, and, we've worked very closely on SBG. Our first podcast was on standards-based grading. We worked together on the big video that we put together about SBG, the brochures, the handbook. I mean, I've been, lucky to be a part of this journey because I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast before. I knew nothing about SBG when I first came on board, and when I first started hearing about it. The first time I had ever heard about it is Assistant Superintendent Hagley had reached out to me saying, hey, we want to work on this video. I'm going to be at ECO working on some stuff. Can you come shoot video and whatever? And I was driving down St. Francis on my way to ECO. Mind you, the conversation when he had asked me about it was a week or two before.
Right.
And I called him and I was like, hey, by the way, what is this video about? Because I had no idea. He had told me, let's work on a video. And I was like, okay, cool. I'll put it on my calendar. And so I'm driving down St. Francis and he explained standards-based grading. It's this, initiative that we're working on and whatever. I got to ECO and he explained it to me for the first time. And I don't want to say I fell in love, but I was very intrigued by the premise of it. In the shortest way of explaining it that I can think of that encapsulates what SBG is, it's looking at students for what they know, not what they do.
Absolutely.
And it resonated with me because if you looked at my grades from a 100-foot view, you'd be like, oh, he was an average student, B, C kid, popped an A here and there and just kind of middled it. But a lot of that was I didn't turn in homework. I was not a compliant student. And so my grades reflected that. Looking at my grades, you would say, yep, he's average. He knows whatever. Not that I was the brightest kid, but my grades reflected lesser of what I knew and more of
the compliance piece,
exactly.
The behavior.
And that really stood out to me because I think I resonated with it because I was one of those students, as I think many of us are. A misconception I had speaking with the executive director of curriculum instruction, Peter McWayne. It's like, oh, the guy who oversees curriculum and instruction must be brilliant, valedictorian of his class, and frankly, quite the opposite. So after that, I just kind of really dove into SBG and really loved the meaning behind it is giving kids a fair shot at this is what I know, not what I do.
Right.
The thing with SBG, and it kind of goes back to the question that I asked in the beginning, is, we're starting to see some of the results from SBG, but it's something that's going to take a couple of years, a time to see how these kids progress. What they learned in third grade, the student was getting 3s, they were proficient. Does that carry over into fourth grade and carry over into fifth grade when you can really was that intentional focus on learning? Did that benefit them as they got to fourth grade and fifth grade? And, for the older kids, you can look at what they did in the first 6 years. And then if they made that transition in sixth grade, see what the second half of it looked like. So I think SBG is a great example of kind of the goal that you would have for especially the C&I part of this is that equity piece of grading kids on what
Giving
they know.
Everyone a fair playing ground.
Yeah.
And we're making it across school sites for every student, regardless of, where they come from, whether they may have an IEP, wherever. It's
or their
equal
personal
access, right?
Or their personal situations.
Right.
And I think, coming from where I'm from, I don't have, we didn't grow up with ELs. Even just the idea of a 14 or 15-year-old kid working to provide for their family was still very out of the realm of normality for where I'm from. But you have kids that are working at 15 or 16 years old to provide for their family because they came from Mexico, and that if they want to be here because, being in America is better than being in Mexico, the kid has to work. And so there's other factors that go into these kids' lives. And just because they didn't complete 10, 20, 30 question, math assignment at night for homework doesn't mean they should be penalized for it if they know the material.
I agree. And just personally, I share this all the time. I grew up from a working class family and
around education too.
Well, no, to be quite honest, like my dad didn't go to school till he was in his 40s.
Oh, wow.
And before that, I mean, hardworking family, like both my parents, but we didn't see a change in our family life until my dad completed college. But the message since I was a kid was you go to school and you get a good education. And I was fortunate that I had great teachers that also not just looked at the academics, but also made personal connections with me. I'm just saying, like, all kids, regardless of their background, deserve a well-rounded education, because I do believe that's like the key to get out of poverty,
it's the foundation of everything else that happens in life.
To get a good job or to get into a good career in technical field. Like, having all these opportunities
and exposure
makes such a big difference. And so I think that's where my heart and my belief have always.
And I think for me, I get jealous when I go to schools now. Especially recently, I've been doing a lot of filming with the digital learning coaches, and I see all of the resources that these kids have. And I'm only doing it because I like tech and technology and all of that stuff. But, you know, you having first and second graders learning about coding at a young age. And
Isn't
granted, it's not like, oh, they're not hopping on a computer and typing JavaScript or, you know, whatever it is. But one of the examples is like they have a mouse, and they build this course for a mouse, and they have to go one forward, one forward, one forward, turn, one forward, turn, one forward, and you know, they're learning the basic elements of coding at what, first graders are 6 years old?
Yes.
And, you know, that's setting the foundation for as they get older, and that exposure at such a young age. We always talked about the earlier you can learn a second language, the easier it is to grasp on. The same thing goes with other concepts, coding and all of this other stuff. So I get jealous that these kids being exposed to so much more than I ever was. And I graduated high school in 2012. So I'm not that far removed from school.
Right.
And the advances that they've made in 10 years and what these kids are being exposed to is out of this world, truly out of this world.
It's awesome. It's amazing.
I appreciate you sitting down and chatting with me. I have two things left before we say goodbye.
Okay.
The first is from the We Are Not Strangers game. I have a card picked, and the card that I have chosen is... What has been your earliest recollection of happiness?
My earliest recollection of happiness. I would say just now that the seasons are changing in spring, I absolutely love spring, but memories of being a kid and going to Pecos and having these like picnics or Easter egg hunts. And so I think the spring weather just kind of takes me back to all those good times with my family.
Nostalgia.
Yeah.
I love that. There's something about the air in the spring too. It's fresh. In the fall, you smell the leaves, which has its smell of its own, but in the winter it's cold. And then the spring, it's like rebirth.
It is.
It's fantastic.
It is. I love it.
And then, so the last question, the one I will end with is, what is the best piece of advice or guidance that you've ever received from a teacher?
There were several teachers that I can think of. I had an amazing third grade teacher, my high school English teacher, and I think it was just, the message was just your effort goes a long way. And I truly believe that. Hard work and effort, like you can't go wrong with that. But yeah, I remember being a junior in high school, and my English teacher said you should take an English AP class. I never even considered it. But she was like, all you have to do is try. And I guess believing in myself. And so I had these mentors where I probably just questioned my own ability. And I would even say in my career, just not seeing myself in certain positions, but having great mentors and people that saw things in me and gave good advice, like just work hard and give it a shot. So I guess I'll end with that.